a little girl no one believed, a bomb no one could see. And 60 seconds before a Korean Mafia boss stepped onto the plane that would kill him, she ran. If you've ever been ignored when you knew something was wrong, this story will break you open. Watch until the end, hit that like button, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The afternoon Zuri Okafor decided to run toward a criminal instead of away from him started the same way every afternoon started. With the smell of jet fuel, the distant whine of turbines spinning up somewhere beyond the chain-link fence, and the particular flavor of loneliness that settles into a child's chest when she walks home from school alone. She was 8 years old. She had been walking this stretch of Meridian Avenue every school day since the beginning of 3rd grade. Always at the same time, always with her backpack straps adjusted exactly 2 clicks tighter than the school required, always with her head slightly down and her ears slightly open because the world was louder than most people realized, and Zuri Okafor heard things other people didn't. That was the gift. Or the curse. She hadn't decided yet. Her father, Dr. Emmanuel Okafor, had called it a superpower once, in the kitchen of their old apartment on the east side, the one they'd had to leave after he got sick. He'd said it while stirring his tea, not even looking at her, just saying it the way he said most important things, quietly, without announcement, like it was just a fact about the weather. He'd said, "Your ear is better than mine, Zoo. You hear the music inside the language. That's rarer than you think. Don't ever let anyone convince you to stop listening." He died 14 months ago. Pancreatic cancer, stage 4, discovered too late because they didn't have good insurance, and the first doctor they saw misread the scans. And by the time anyone said the word cancer out loud, it was already a sentence. Her mother, Adeyeze Okafor, worked double shifts at the laundry on Clement Street now. She worked until her hands cracked and bled, and she still came home smelling like detergent, and quietly folded whatever bills had arrived and put them in the plastic organizer on top of the refrigerator without ever saying how bad it was. She didn't need to say it. Zuri was 8, not blind. So Zuri walked home alone every day past Meridian Aviation, the private airfield wedged between an industrial park and a storage facility on the south side of the city, behind a fence that had 3 strands of wire along the top, and a gate that was always either just opening or just closing. She walked past it because it was the straightest route home, and because a bus transfer would cost an extra $1.50, and because she'd learned very early that the things people didn't notice could teach you more than the things they made noise about. She noticed the planes. She noticed the men in dark suits who came and went from the smaller terminal building. She noticed that certain vehicles never idled. They either sat completely still or moved with purpose, no in between. She noticed language. That was the one she couldn't turn off. Her father had spoken to her in 6 languages across the span of her short life: English, Igbo, French, Mandarin, Russian, and Yoruba. Not because he expected fluency in all of them, but because he believed the architecture of different languages trained the brain to hear nuance that monolingual people simply couldn't access. He'd started when she was still in diapers. By the time she was 5, she could identify a language within 3 or 4 syllables. By the time she was 7, she was reading Russian children's books with him on Sunday mornings. By the time he died, she understood approximately 60% of spoken Russian, though she couldn't have explained the grammar to save her life. None of that mattered on a Thursday afternoon in October when she was just trying to get home before dark, and her sneakers had a small hole in the left toe where the cold air came through. She was level with the second gate of the Meridian Aviation Complex when she heard them. 2 men standing on the near side of the perimeter fence, close enough that she could have hit them with a thrown stone. She registered them in her peripheral vision first. Both white, both large, both wearing the particular shade of dark charcoal that men in private security preferred, both with the kind of stillness that wasn't relaxed but controlled. One was smoking, one was looking at his phone. They appeared to be doing nothing. They were speaking Russian. She slowed without meaning to, not stopped. Slowed. The way you slow when you think you might have left something behind and you're checking your mental inventory. Her body made the decision before her brain caught up. The man with the cigarette said something to the man with the phone, and the man with the phone responded, and Zuri's brain, which had been trained for years on her father's precise academic Russian and his collection of Russian folk story recordings, started processing the syllables automatically the way it always did, the way she couldn't stop it from doing even when she tried. She caught fragments at first. Something about timing, something about altitude. The word for plane, samoliot. The word for trigger, spuskovoy kryuchok. And then, clearly, unmistakably, in the kind of sentence her father would have made her repeat back to him for pronunciation practice. The phrase that translated roughly to when it reaches 12,000 feet, the circuit closes. Zuri stopped walking. She stood on the public sidewalk outside the chain-link fence, and she was completely still. And the man with the cigarette glanced over at her, and then looked away because she was just a kid with a too big backpack and a hole in her sneaker, which meant she was invisible, which was the thing about being 8 and black and small that she had already begun to understand with a clarity that was going to take years to fully metabolize. The man with the phone said something about the device, ustroystvo. The word was ustroystvo, and about the interior wall of the cabin, and about a frequency that would be masked by the aircraft's own electronics until it was too late. The man with the cigarette laughed, but it wasn't a happy laugh. It was the laugh of someone who had already decided something and was relieved the deciding was over. Then the man with the phone said a name, Kang Tae Jin. Zuri had never heard that name before in her life, but she heard the way the man said it, quietly, precisely, with a kind of careful neutrality that people use when they're talking about something they're afraid of, something they respect enough to be cautious around even in private. And she understood that this name meant something very serious. The man with the cigarette ground it out under his heel. They both straightened slightly and walked back through the service entrance in the fence. Badges swiped, gate clicking shut behind them, conversation over. Zuri stood on the sidewalk. Her heart was doing something strange. It wasn't quite pounding. It was more like a very fast, very shallow fluttering, the way a bird feels when you cup it in both hands. She was 8 years old, and she had just heard 2 men in security uniforms discuss the exact mechanical details of a bomb aboard an airplane and the name of the man it was intended to kill. She looked at the terminal building through the fence. She looked at the tarmac beyond it. She could see the tail of a large private jet from where she stood, white with a blue stripe, engines already running from the sound of it, the kind of aircraft she'd watched land and depart dozens of times on this route home. She could see people moving near it, uniformed ground crew, more men in dark suits. She thought about what her father had said, not the superpower part. The other part, the part he'd said only once, the winter before he got his diagnosis when they'd passed a car accident on the expressway, and she'd asked him why some people slowed down and some people kept driving. He'd said, "The people who keep driving have decided the emergency belongs to someone else. The people who slow down have decided it belongs to everyone." Zuri Okafor tightened her backpack straps. Then she ran toward the terminal entrance. The main entrance to the Meridian Aviation private terminal was a glass double door with a security desk just inside, staffed by a middle-aged man in a pale blue uniform shirt who had the particular expression of someone who had stopped expecting anything interesting to happen approximately 11 years ago. His name tag said Gerald. He was reading something on a tablet held low behind the counter. Zuri pushed through the door and walked directly to the desk and said, "Excuse me, I need to report something urgent. I think there's a bomb on one of the planes." Gerald looked up. He looked at her the way people looked at stray cats who wandered into buildings. Not unkind, not particularly alarmed, just fundamentally confused about what protocol was supposed to apply here. "Honey," he said, "are you lost?" "No, sir. I was walking past the fence and I heard 2 men talking. They were speaking Russian. They said there's an explosive device installed in the wall of one of the cabins. An altitude trigger. It activates at 12,000 feet. The plane is getting ready to leave right now." Gerald set the tablet down. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "Where are your parents?" "My mom is at work." "Please, this is serious." "I heard them very clearly. The device is in the interior wall of the cabin. They said the man named Kang Tae Jin is the target. The plane is out there right now." "Okay, sweetheart." Gerald came around from behind the desk with the careful movements of someone managing a situation they'd categorized as minor. He crouched down to her level. His breath smelled like coffee and something artificially grape. "Did someone put you up to this? Is this a dare? A game?" "No. Because we get calls sometimes, people trying to disrupt flights, cause delays." "I'm not calling, I'm standing here. I walked in. I heard men speaking Russian outside your fence, and they said there's a bomb on the plane, and it's going to go off when it reaches altitude, and the person inside is going to die." She paused. She was breathing harder than she wanted to be. "I'm 8 years old. Why would I make this up?" Gerald straightened up and put his hand lightly on her shoulder and steered her toward a row of chairs along the wall. "Let me make a call," he said, in a tone that meant he was going to make no call, or a call to someone who would make no decision. "You wait right here." He went back behind the desk. He picked up his tablet again. He did not pick up a phone. Zuri waited approximately 45 seconds. Then she stood up and walked to the interior door that led to the tarmac side corridor and pushed it open and went through. The corridor smelled like fuel and mechanical oil, and the particular dry cold of air-conditioned spaces that exist only for transitional purposes. It was empty except for a ground crew member in an orange vest walking away from her at the far end. There was another door at the end, propped open with a yellow wedge, and through it she could see the tarmac, see the tail of the white jet with the blue stripe, see the portable stairs that had been wheeled up to the aircraft's forward door. She could also see, moving across the tarmac toward those stairs, with the unhurried certainty of a man who believed the space around him belonged to him, a group of people. At the center of the group was a man. He was taller than she expected. He wore a dark suit with no tie, the collar of his white shirt open at the throat, and he moved with a kind of self-contained density. Not arrogance exactly, but the physical certainty of someone for whom the question of personal safety had long since been delegated entirely to other people. His hair was dark and slightly long, brushed back. She could see, where his shirt opened at the collar, the edge of something dark and complex on his skin. Ink, a tattoo, curling upward from his chest. Around him moved at least 8 individuals in various formations, all of them large, all of them scanning. 2 of them were the men from the fence. She recognized them immediately. The cigarette man was now positioned to the left and slightly behind the man in the center. The phone man was on the right. Both of them were performing the same controlled alertness as the other guards, giving nothing away, completely indistinguishable from the rest of the detail. Zuri ran. She hit the exterior door before anyone on the tarmac had registered her, the yellow wedge scattering as she pushed through. And she was outside in the thin October light, and the roar of the jet engines hit her like a physical thing, the vibration of them in her sternum. And she was sprinting across the painted tarmac, and people were turning and someone was shouting, but she had fixed her gaze on the man at the center of the group, and she ran directly toward him and screamed as loud as she had ever screamed anything in her life. "Stop! Don't get on the plane! There's a bomb!" Everything happened simultaneously and in slow motion. The 2 guards nearest to her moved first, professionals fast, closing the distance between her and the principal in under 2 seconds. One of them caught her by the arm with a grip that wasn't cruel but was absolute, lifting her slightly off the ground, and the other moved in front of the man at the center as a physical barrier. Someone behind her was shouting, Gerald or another terminal employee she couldn't turn to see. The other guards had spread and tightened simultaneously, a practiced contraction, the whole group suddenly denser and more angular. The man at the center stopped walking. He turned. His face was not what she expected. She had, in the adrenaline-lit seconds of her sprint, constructed some kind of monster in her imagination. The word mafia boss from the Russian conversation had done something to her visual expectations. But the face that turned toward her was simply a man's face. Strong features, fine lines at the corners of eyes that were currently doing something very specific, looking at her not with dismissal, but with a quality of attention that she had rarely experienced from adults. He was looking at her the way her father used to look at her when she said something that surprised him, like she might have something worth hearing. He was also, she noticed distantly, watching the 2 guards who had first responded, the cigarette man and the phone man, with a quality of attention that was different from how he watched everyone else. Quieter. More still. The guard holding her arm said something to him in Korean. The man at the center said something back, short, and the guard's grip on her arm loosened, though he didn't let go entirely. She was breathing in huge, ragged pulls. The engine roar was enormous, and her vision had gone slightly bright at the edges the way it did when she ran too hard. The man at the center looked at her for a long moment without speaking. Then, in English that carried only a slight accent, he said, "What did you hear?" She told him. She told him everything, not in a rush, because she understood instinctively that rushing would make her sound hysterical, And hysterical would mean dismissed, so she said it the way her father had taught her to present information, clearly and in sequence. She said she'd been walking past the fence. She said she'd heard two men speaking Russian. She repeated the Russian phrases as accurately as she could, the words she recognized, the grammar her father had drilled into her. She said altitude trigger. She said 12,000 feet. She said interior wall of the cabin. She said device, ustrojstvo. She said Kang Tae-jin, pronouncing it the way the man with the phone had pronounced it, which was probably imperfect but close enough. Throughout all of it, the man at the center watched her with that same quality of absolute attention. Around them, the other guards were also listening, most of them with skepticism written in their posture, the slight forward lean of people indulging something they expect to end quickly. But not all of them. Not the man directly to the principal's left, who was shorter than the rest with a lean, angular face, and who was also watching the cigarette man and the phone man. When she finished, there was a silence that lasted perhaps 3 seconds and felt like considerably longer. Then the cigarette man spoke. He said, in English with a Russian accent she now recognized immediately, "Mr. Kang, this is a child who wandered onto restricted property. We should remove her and continue." "In Russian," said Kang Tae-jin, still looking at Zuri. "What does ustrojstvo mean?" He said it perfectly. Whatever else he was, he had ears too. The cigarette man stopped speaking. Zuri watched his face. She watched the exact moment it changed. Not a lot, not dramatically, just a slight tension around the eyes and a particular stillness that settled into his jaw. The kind of stillness that isn't relaxed but is controlled. The kind that looked like nothing because it was working very hard to look like nothing. Kang Tae-jin saw it. She was certain of that because he looked at the angular-faced man on his left, and something passed between them that was not words. What happened next was very fast and very precise. The angular-faced man moved. 2 other guards moved. The cigarette man reacted half a second too late, that half second being the difference between a professional response and a caught response. And within the space of 4 or 5 seconds, both he and the phone man were restrained efficiently and without ceremony. Their arms behind them, their forward momentum stopped completely. The cigarette man said something in Russian. Zuri understood 2 words, mistake and child. He was saying this was a mistake, the child was wrong, she had misunderstood. Kang Tae-jin finally looked away from Zuri. He looked at the 2 restrained men. He looked at them the way you look at something that has already been decided. He said something in Korean to the angular-faced man. The angular-faced man spoke into a radio. 3 more people came from somewhere, 2 in technical clothing, carrying cases, moving toward the aircraft stairs with the particular urgency of people who knew exactly what they were looking for. The whole group stood on the tarmac in the thin October light, while the jet engines continued to whine, and the portable stairs stood in place, and the city made its distant traffic sounds beyond the fence, and Zuri Okafor stood in the middle of it with the guard's hand no longer on her arm. He had let go at some point, and she realized her own hands were shaking slightly, which she found almost interesting because she hadn't felt afraid during any of it. She'd felt something closer to the feeling of solving a very hard problem, and the shaking seemed to be happening in retrospect. The technical team was on the aircraft for 11 minutes. She counted because she needed something to do with the time, and counting was something her brain could hold on to. When the man in the lead came back down the stairs, he was carrying something in a sealed case that he held away from his body. He spoke to Kang Tae-jin directly. She didn't understand what he said, but she understood the expression on Kang Tae-jin's face when he heard it. It was not relief. Not exactly. It was the expression of a man who has survived so many close things that the surviving has become its own kind of burden, and who is now holding one more of them and trying to find somewhere in himself to put it. He turned back to Zuri. She expected a lot of things from this moment. She expected to be removed from the property. She expected someone to finally call her mother. She expected possibly a conversation with police or airport officials, or some variety of official person with a form and a skeptical expression. She expected to be processed, thanked minimally, and released. He crouched down. Kang Tae-jin, with his dragon tattoos and his empire and his 8 guards and his private jet that had almost killed him, crouched down on the tarmac until he was at her eye level, and he looked at her directly. His eyes, up close, were dark and sharp and tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. He said, "What is your name?" "Zuri," she said. "Zuri Okafor." How old are you, Zuri Okafor? 8. He studied her face for another moment. Then he said, Why did you run toward me instead of away? She thought about it. Not because she didn't know, but because she wanted to say it correctly. My dad said, she started. She stopped. The shaking in her hands had moved into her throat slightly, and she wasn't going to cry on a tarmac in front of a criminal and 8 guards, so she swallowed it hard and started again. My dad used to say that when someone is about to get hurt, the only question is whether you help or whether you keep walking, and I knew, so I couldn't keep walking. Kang Tae-jin was very quiet for a moment. Then he stood up. He spoke to the angular-faced man in Korean, something longer, something that made the angular-faced man glance at her and then nod. He spoke into the radio again. There was activity at the edges of the group. You'll be driven home, Kang Tae-jin said to her. Someone will speak with your mother. You don't need to worry about anything tonight. She gets off work at 9, Zuri said, which was not the response she'd planned on making, but it came out anyway. She doesn't know I heard anything. She's going to be worried. We'll contact her, he said. She won't be worried long. She almost asked how they would contact her, who would explain this, what exactly they would say. She almost asked a lot of things. But she looked at his face again, see the tiredness in it, the something underneath the tiredness, and she understood somehow that the conversation was over, not dismissed, just complete. He had received everything he needed from her, and now there were other operations beginning that she was not part of. One of the guards led her toward a black vehicle idling near the terminal side of the tarmac. She walked with him. She looked back once. Kang Tae-jin was standing in the same spot, and he was looking at her. And for just a moment before she got into the car, she thought she saw something in his expression that she recognized but couldn't name. Not gratitude exactly, because gratitude was too small for it. More like the look of someone who has just seen something that changes the size of a room they thought they already knew perfectly. Then the car door closed and the tarmac disappeared behind tinted glass. And Zuri sat in the leather seat with her too big backpack on her lap and the hole in her left sneaker and her father's voice in her memory telling her she had a superpower, and she finally let herself shake. The drive to her apartment building took 22 minutes. The guard who drove said nothing the entire time, which was fine. She didn't want to talk. She looked out the window at the city moving past, the laundromats and the chicken places and the kids on corners, and the traffic signals cycling through their colors with their own indifferent rhythm. And she thought about the sealed case the technician had carried down the aircraft stairs, and about the cigarette man's jaw going still, and about the fact that somewhere between the fence and this car, she had stepped across a line that she probably couldn't step back over. She didn't know what happened to people who got involved in things like this. She didn't know if that was dangerous in ways that hadn't shown themselves yet. She didn't know if Kang Tae-jin's word, she'll be driven home, she won't worry long, meant anything in a world where a man's own bodyguards had hidden a bomb in his airplane. She knew that she had heard something and had run toward it instead of away, and that a man was alive who wouldn't have been. She thought her father would have said that was the only part that mattered. She was mostly certain he was right. She was 8 years old and not entirely sure she believed it yet, but she was working on it. The car stopped in front of her building on Driscoll Street. The guard came around and opened the door, which no one had ever done for her before, and stood back. She climbed out with her backpack. "Someone will reach your mother," the guard said. It was the first thing he'd said since they left the tarmac. "Okay," she said. "You did something significant today." She looked up at him. He had the face of a person who had seen many things and was not in the habit of saying things like that, and was saying it now because it was true. "I know," she said, because she did know. That wasn't arrogance. It was just accounting. She walked to the front door of her building. She heard the car pull away behind her. The elevator in her building didn't work on Wednesdays or Thursdays, which meant she climbed 4 flights of stairs to their apartment, and she stood in the hallway with her key in the door for a moment before she turned it. Inside it was quiet and clean in the careful way her mother kept it. Everything had a place, and everything was in it. Not because they had many things, but because the things they had were organized with precision, because order was one of the things you could control when other things weren't. There was a casserole dish covered in foil on the stove, the oven set to warm, her mother's handwriting on a sticky note. "Eat when you get home. I'll be back by 9. Call Mrs. Adiemi downstairs if anything." Zuri put her backpack down by the door. She washed her hands at the kitchen sink. She served herself from the casserole dish, which was jollof rice, still warm, the way her mother made it on the night she knew she'd be working late. She sat at the kitchen table and ate. The apartment was very quiet. Outside, the city did its evening things. A car alarm briefly, someone's radio, the hydraulic sigh of a bus on the street below. Normal sounds. The sound of a Thursday evening that had no idea what had happened 4 miles south of here on a tarmac beside a private airfield. Zuri ate her rice. She thought about what came next. She thought about the fact that Kang Tae-jin knew where she lived now, which was either safe or wasn't, and she didn't have enough information to know which yet. She thought about her mother coming home and what she would say, and whether the guards promised contact would happen before or after that conversation, and whether she was in some kind of trouble that hadn't arrived yet. Her phone buzzed on the table. Unknown number. She picked it up. A woman's voice, professional and calm. Miss Okafor, my name is Soo Yan. I work for Mr. Kang. He asked me to contact your mother directly, but we wanted to check in with you first. Are you home safe? Yes, Zuri said. Good. Your mother will be contacted shortly, and everything will be explained to her. Mr. Kang would like to meet with both of you tomorrow evening if you're willing. You're under no obligation. Zuri looked at the sticky note in her mother's handwriting. She looked at the careful arrangement of the kitchen, the foil-covered casserole, the organized scarcity of the refrigerator magnets, the small crack in the plaster near the window that her mother had covered with a picture frame. She thought about what no obligation meant when the person using the phrase employed the kind of people who had carried a bomb off a private jet this afternoon. She thought about what Kang Tae-jin's expression had meant on the tarmac, and whether it was the expression of a man who paid debts or the expression of a man who made them. Can I ask you something? Zuri said. Of course, said Soo-yeon. The 2 men who were arrested on the tarmac, were they actually his bodyguards, like people he trusted? A pause, not long but present. Yes, Soo-yeon said. They were. Zuri sat with that for a moment. Okay, she said. We'll come. She hung up the phone. She looked at the crack in the plaster behind the picture frame. She thought about a man surrounded by 8 guards who had 2 killers inside his own perimeter. She thought about the way he had crouched down on the tarmac and looked at her without either pity or condescension, just clear attention, like she was a complete and serious person. She thought about the fact that she had agreed to go meet with him tomorrow, and she hadn't asked her mother yet, and that conversation was going to be significantly more complicated than anything that had happened on the tarmac today. Her mother's key turned in the lock at 9:14 p.m. Adaeze Okafor came through the door, still wearing her work uniform, her hair wrapped, her hands that particular shade of redness they got from the chemicals and the water. She looked at Zuri, who was sitting at the kitchen table with her homework open in front of her, and her expression arranged very carefully into something neutral. Her mother looked at her for a long moment. What happened? Said Adaeze Okafor. Not a question. She had the particular radar of a woman who has been navigating hard things alone for 14 months. Zuri opened her mouth. Her mother's phone rang. An unknown number. Her mother looked at the screen, looked back at Zuri. Something moved across her face. She answered it. Zuri watched her mother's face change over the course of the next 4 minutes, from the controlled blankness of someone processing unexpected information to something tighter and more frightened, to something she couldn't quite read, some combination of terror and disbelief, and something underneath both of those that might have been, against all logic, a species of pride. When her mother hung up, they looked at each other across the kitchen table. You ran onto a tarmac, her mother said. Yes. You ran onto a tarmac to stop a man from getting on an airplane because you heard people outside a fence speaking Russian. Yes. Her mother sat down. She put her cracked red hands flat on the table. She looked at them for a moment. Then she looked up. Your father, she said, and stopped. Tried again. Your father would have... and stopped again, her jaw working, her eyes doing something complicated. Zuri waited. He would have said you were exactly right, her mother finally said quietly. I know, Zuri said. They sat with that for a moment. Then her mother said, This man, Kang Tae-jin, do you know who he is? Not exactly. I know he's important. I know people were trying to kill him. He's not a good man, Zuri. I know that too. Her mother looked at her. Something shifted in her expression. The fear was still there, but something else was settling around it. Some accommodation her mother was making in real time with a reality she hadn't chosen and couldn't return. "We're going to meet him tomorrow," Adeyeze said. Not a question. "That's what I was thinking." Her mother exhaled slowly. She looked at the picture frame covering the crack in the plaster. She looked at the foil-covered casserole on the stove that Zuri had eaten half of and covered back up. She looked at the plastic organizer on top of the refrigerator with its organized bills. "Get ready for bed," she said. "We'll talk more in the morning." Zuri closed her homework and put it in her backpack. She went to the bathroom and brushed her teeth and changed into her pajamas and climbed into the bed she'd had since she was 5, which was technically too small for her now, but they hadn't replaced it yet, and she lay there in the dark and listened to the city outside. She thought about tomorrow. She thought about what kind of man agreed to meet with the child who saved his life. She thought about what he wanted and whether wanting and needing were the same thing for a man like that, and whether either of those things would be good for an 8-year-old girl and her mother who were running out of space in their lives for things that weren't good for them. She thought about her father, who would have asked her what she learned today. She would have said, "I learned that the most dangerous thing in the room isn't always the person everyone is afraid of." She would have said, "I learned that if you're small enough, people can't see you even when you're standing right in front of them." She would have said, "I think I'm in something now. I don't know what it is yet, but I think I'm in it." Somewhere across the city, in a penthouse overlooking the skyline, a man she'd spoken to for less than 10 minutes was sitting with the fact that he was alive because a child had done the thing everyone else had refused to do. And the 2 men who had tried to kill him, the men he had trusted, the men who had known his patterns and his schedule and the exact interior dimensions of his aircraft, were now somewhere being asked questions whose answers would begin to unravel something much larger than one bomb on one tarmac. Zuri Okafor lay in her too small bed with the city humming outside and understood, in the way that children sometimes understand things before they have words for them, that tomorrow was going to be the day that everything changed. She didn't know yet whether that was good. But her father's voice in her memory wasn't worried, and so she closed her eyes and waited for morning and for whatever came through the door of it. The morning came in gray and cold the way October mornings did in this city, the kind of light that didn't so much arrive as simply make the dark less complete. And Adeyeze Okafor was already awake when it did, sitting at the kitchen table with her hands wrapped around a mug of tea she hadn't drunk, staring at the plastic organizer on top of the refrigerator like it owed her something. She hadn't slept. Zuri knew because she'd heard her mother moving around the apartment at 2 in the morning, at 3:30, at 5. The small sounds of a woman trying not to make noise while her mind refused to stop working. Zuri had lain in her too small bed and listened and not said anything because there was nothing to say yet that would help. Now it was 7:15 and they sat across from each other at the kitchen table with toast between them that neither of them was eating and the gray light coming through the window and the city starting its morning sounds below. "Tell me again," her mother said, not accusatory, just needing to hear it a second time in the daylight to see if it changed shape. Zuri told her again. All of it, from the fence to the tarmac to the car ride home to the phone call. She left nothing out. Her mother listened with the stillness she used when she was managing something very large in a very small container. When Zuri finished, her mother picked up her tea and finally drank some of it. Set the mug down. Said, "The woman who called, Su Yan." "Yes." "She said it would be tonight, that a car would come at 7. "That's what she said." Her mother looked out the window. A pigeon was doing something determined on the fire escape. Her mother watched it for a moment like it was the only thing in the frame worth looking at. "I've heard his name," her mother said quietly. "Kang Tai Jin. People talk, at the laundry, at the market. People say his name the way you say the name of a weather system, like it's a fact of geography." Zuri waited. "They say he controls things," her mother said. "Permits, certain contracts, protection, things that shouldn't involve him but do." "I know." "You don't know, Zuri. You're 8. "I know enough." Her mother looked at her. That look, the one that was equal parts exhaustion and something that might have been the beginning of helplessness, which Adeyeze Okafor had spent 14 months refusing to feel, lasted a few seconds, and then her mother pulled it back and put her face in order. "We'll go tonight," her mother said, "but you let me do the talking." Zuri thought about the tarmac. about crouching on the tarmac, about the expression on Kang Tae-jin's face and the question he'd asked, and the fact that he had asked it of her, not at her. She said, "Okay," and meant approximately 60% of it. School was its own particular unreality that day. Zuri sat in her third-grade classroom and did her work and answered when called on and ate her lunch alone at the end of the table the way she usually did. Not because she had no one to sit with, but because the conversations around her were about things that seemed, today, to have been generated in a completely different universe. Someone had gotten a new game. Someone's cousin had said something at someone's birthday. The carpet had a new stain near the reading corner, and there was a theory about its origin that had apparently consumed significant social energy. Zuri thought about altitude triggers and interior cabin walls and the way the cigarette man's jaw had gone still. She thought about what happened to people who tried to kill Kang Tae-jin and failed. She thought about the two of them, the cigarette man, the phone man, and wondered who else was involved, because something that organized didn't start with two men outside a fence. It started somewhere much earlier and much deeper, and the two men were just the surface of it. Her teacher asked her twice if she was feeling all right. She said yes both times. She was feeling extremely all right. She was feeling more precisely calibrated to the actual nature of the world than she had ever felt in her life, which was both clarifying and uncomfortable, like having your vision corrected so suddenly that the sharpness itself becomes a kind of vertigo. The car came at 7 exactly. It was not the same car as yesterday. It was larger, darker, and there were two of them, a lead vehicle and the one they were placed into. And Zuri noticed without comment that the man who opened their door and the man who drove were not the same man as yesterday, and that neither of them spoke unless spoken to. Her mother sat very straight in the back seat with her purse in her lap and her hands folded over it. She was wearing the dress she wore to interviews and to the school event she didn't miss no matter how tired she was. She had her earrings in. She had done all of this while Zuri watched from the doorway of the bathroom, and it occurred to Zuri that dressing carefully for a meeting you were afraid of was its own kind of armor. The penthouse was on the 42nd floor of a building in the financial district that Zuri had walked past 100 times without registering as anything other than glass and geometry. The elevator opened directly into the space, no hallway, no anteroom, just the elevator doors parting, and then all of it at once. The city spread across 3 walls of floor-to-ceiling glass. The skyline lit against the dark like a second version of the stars. The interior that was both more severe and more beautiful than she expected, less decorated and more considered, everything in it chosen rather than accumulated. There were 4 people in the room besides Kang Tae-jin. The angular-faced man from the tarmac, whose name she would learn tonight was Park Jin-ho, and who functioned as something between a chief of security and a right hand. A woman in her 40s with close-cut hair and a tablet in her hand who moved around the room's edges like water-finding level, which was Soo-yeon, and 2 others positioned near the elevator and near the internal staircase who did not introduce themselves and were not expected to. Kang Tae-jin rose from a chair near the window when they came in. He was dressed differently than the tarmac. Still a dark suit, but the jacket was off and hung somewhere. And he wore a charcoal shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows, and the full extent of the tattoos on his arms was visible. Dragons? Not decorative, but architectural, climbing from his wrists to disappear under the folded fabric at his biceps. Black ink with a quality of age to it, these were not recent choices. He crossed the room and offered his hand first to her mother. "Mrs. Okafor," he said, "thank you for coming. I understand this is unusual." Her mother shook his hand. Her face gave nothing. "Unusual is one word for it," she said. He looked at her mother for a moment with that same quality of attention he'd given Zuri on the tarmac. Not performing, just actually receiving. Then he looked at Zuri. "Zuri," he said, just her name, like acknowledging a fact. "Mr. Kang," she said. The angular-faced man, Park Jin-ho, moved a slight amount near the window, and something about that small movement made Zuri look at him and then look back at Kang Tae-jin, because Jin-ho's eyes had gone to the tattoos on Tae-jin's forearms for just a fraction of a second in a way that suggested this casual presentation. The jacket off, the sleeves up, the full visible extent of a man who did not need to prove anything, was in fact a decision. They sat, her mother and Zuri on one side of a low table, Tae-jin across from them, Jin-ho standing to his left. Soo-yeon brought tea without being asked. The city glittered through the glass behind them all. Tae-jin said, "I'll be direct with you. I owe your daughter my life. That's not a figure of speech. The device on my aircraft was functional, sophisticated, and would have killed everyone aboard when we reached cruising altitude. If Zuri hadn't heard what she heard and done what she did, that jet would be debris somewhere over the coast right now." Adeze Okafor's hands tightened on her purse, once, and then she made them still. "She told me what she heard," her mother said. "She told me everything. The men who planted it were part of my personal security detail," Tae-jin said. "People I'd worked with for 3 years. They had access, they had knowledge of my movements, and they had been paid by someone who wants my organization to collapse." He paused. "I'm telling you this so you understand why I need to speak about it directly. The threat to me is not resolved. Last night I removed 2 people. The rest of it is still there. The rest of it." Zuri filed that phrase in the careful mental drawer she had started building overnight. "What does that have to do with my daughter?" her mother said. The question was precise. Not hostile, not frightened, just exact. "Nothing further," Tae-jin said. "She's done everything she'll ever need to do. I'm not here to ask for anything else from her." He looked at Zuri directly as he said this, and she believed him, which didn't mean she trusted him, but it was a start. "I'm here because a debt exists, and I intend to address it. Practically, specifically, and without conditions." Her mother said nothing, waiting. "Your current situation," he said, not unkindly, "is one I understand better than you might expect. Your husband's medical bills, the apartment, your income against the cost of this city. He didn't say it the way people said it when they wanted you to feel small. He said it the way a navigator says the coordinates, just location, no judgment. I'd like to change it, immediately and permanently." "No," her mother said. The room was quiet. Tae-jin had not moved. His expression hadn't changed. He said, "No." "I don't know what your money is made from," Adeze Okafor said. "I have a suspicion. I'm not going to ask you to confirm it because the answer doesn't change what I'm going to say, which is that I'm not in a position to accept anything that comes with a history I can't account for. My daughter saved your life because it was right, not because there was a transaction involved." Jinho made a slight movement near the window again. Not threatening. Zuri thought it was the movement of a man who was recalibrating his read of the people across the table. Tae-jin looked at her mother for a long moment. Something in his face that wasn't quite surprise, but was adjacent to it. "That's a more complicated answer than I expected," he said. "I'm a more complicated woman than you expected." He was quiet. Then, unexpectedly, he said, "Your husband was a linguist." Her mother's jaw tightened fractionally. "How do you know that?" "I know a great deal about the people I invite into this building." "That's not a threat, Mrs. Okafor. It's information." Dr. Emmanuel Okafor. Lagos, then Oxford, then the university here. 6 languages. Published work on tonal phonetics and second language acquisition. He died 18 months ago. Bus. He paused. "He gave your daughter something that saved my life yesterday afternoon. I find it difficult to believe a man who spent his life building that in a child would object to someone acknowledging it in a concrete way." The silence in the room had a different quality now. Zuri watched her mother. She watched the working of her mother's jaw, the controlled steadiness of her hands on the purse, the thing happening behind her eyes that was a very fast and very private calculation. Her mother said, "She has a gift, extraordinary, and it deserves extraordinary education, which I cannot currently provide." "I can," Tae-jin said simply. "I'm not finished," her mother said. "I will accept nothing tied to your operations. Nothing that requires my daughter to understand what it is or where it came from. Nothing that has conditions stated or implied. If you want to address a debt, you do it through a legal structure that she can benefit from when she's grown and able to make her own choices about who she accepts money from." Tae-jin looked at her for a moment. Then he said to Soo-yeon something in Korean. Soo-yeon made a note on her tablet. "A trust," Tae-jin said. "Education specifically. Administered through a legal foundation. Your name on the oversight committee. No contact required between her and me beyond what you choose to permit." Her mother breathed out slowly through her nose. "And housing." Everyone in the room adjusted slightly, including Zuri. "The apartment is not safe," her mother said, and her voice was still level, but something in it had shifted. Some carefully maintained wall had developed a crack that she was deciding, right now, to let someone see. The building's owner has declined 3 requests for repairs. The fire escape on the east side is loose. There is a gas line issue in the basement that has been reported and ignored. We have lived there for 2 years, and I have done everything correctly, and it doesn't matter. She stopped, recalibrated, continued. If you want to address a debt, that's what it looks like. Tae-jin said, "Done." It was said so immediately, so without negotiation or hesitation, that it landed like a different kind of statement than the ones that had preceded it. Not generosity, completion. A man settling accounts with the particular efficiency of someone for whom the dollar amount was genuinely irrelevant. Zuri watched her mother's face close around the acceptance of this, carefully, like a hand closing around something fragile that might break if held too tightly. "I want to ask you something," Zuri said. Both adults looked at her. She had, until this moment, held the silence the way she'd promised. She looked at Tae-jin. "The 2 men from yesterday, the ones who were arrested." Jin-ho shifted again. Tae-jin remained still. "What about them?" he said. "Were they the only ones?" The quality of the silence that followed was different from all the previous silences. It had a different density. "Why do you ask?" Tae-jin said, and his voice was entirely neutral, which told her more than if he'd answered. Because something that organized doesn't start with 2 people outside a fence. Someone gave them access. Someone told them your schedule. Someone knew which plane and when. She held his gaze. If there are more people inside your circle who knew about this, and they find out the 2 men were arrested, they're going to know there's a problem, and they're going to move before you can find them. The room was very still. Jin-ho was looking at her with the expression of a man reassessing a category. Tae-jin said, after a pause that had weight in it, "She's right." It was said to Jin-ho, not to her, but she heard it. Jin-ho said something in Korean. Tae-jin responded. Their voices were low and the exchange was brief, and when it ended, Jin-ho stepped away toward the window and put a phone to his ear. Tae-jin looked back at Zuri with that tired, precise attention. "Yes," he said. "There are more. We don't know how many or how deeply they're positioned. The 2 men from yesterday are being questioned. But you're correct that the people they reported to are likely already aware that the attempt failed." "So they'll try again," Zuri said. "Almost certainly." Her mother said, with controlled fury she was working very hard to keep controlled, "You invited us here knowing this. I invited you here before I fully understood the scope of it," he said. "In the 18 hours since the tarmac, the picture has changed. I'm not going to lie to you about that." "You're telling me," her mother said, "that my daughter is sitting in this room with a man whose enemies have already tried to kill him once and are likely to try again." "I'm telling you so you can make an informed decision about the security of the housing I'm offering," he said, "which will be considerably more secure than your current building." Her mother stood up. The room adjusted. Jin-ho turned from the window. The 2 others near the elevator and the staircase both moved fractionally. Adeze Okafor was not a large woman. She was 5'4" in flat shoes, and she weighed less than she had before her husband got sick, because grief and double shifts were not generous with the body. But she stood up in that room full of large men, and she said, in a voice that was very quiet and very even, and therefore more frightening than anything loud would have been, "My daughter is 8 years old. She heard a conversation she wasn't meant to hear, and she did the right thing. She is not an asset. She is not a piece on a board. She is a child." Tae-jin did not stand. He said, "I know." "Then you understand that what happens next has nothing to do with your war or your organization or whoever is trying to destroy you. What happens next is about her. That's why I'm offering what I'm offering. And I'm telling you that the offer is accepted or rejected based entirely on whether it keeps her safe. Not you, her." Tae-jin held her mother's gaze. Then he said, "Mrs. Okafor, I've spent 30 years building something that apparently couldn't protect me from 2 people I'd trusted for 3 years. Your daughter protected me in 30 seconds. I understand the difference between what I have and what she is." He paused. "The housing is off-site from anything connected to my operations. The foundation is legally separate. No one in my world needs to know her name or her location. That was the plan before tonight. It's still the plan." Her mother stood for another moment. Then she sat back down. The meeting ran another 40 minutes. Su Yan took notes. Practical things were decided. Timelines, legal names, contacts. Her mother asked 3 times for clarification she already understood, which Zuri recognized as the technique of checking whether answers changed under repetition. They didn't. When the elevator took them back down and the lobby door opened onto the street, the city hit them with its ordinary cold and its ordinary noise. A bus at the corner, someone walking a dog, the steam from a grate. All of it unchanged and indifferent, and Zuri and her mother stood on the sidewalk while the 2 black cars waited at the curb. Her mother said, "Don't say it." "I didn't say anything," Zuri said. "You were going to say Dad would have agreed." "I wasn't," Zuri said. Which was not entirely true. They got into the car. They rode back through the city. Her mother was quiet for a long time, and then she said, looking out the window at the passing streets, "He's not safe, Zuri. He's not a good person, and he's not safe, and the people who want to hurt him are not going to stop because he changed an address and set up a fund." "I know," Zuri said. "Then why do I feel like you've already decided something?" Zuri looked out her own window at the city going by. The lit windows, the dark storefronts, the people on corners doing whatever people on corners do at 9 in the evening, all of it continuous and indifferent. She said, "Because something is still wrong. The 2 men they caught, someone sent them, and that someone doesn't know yet whether they failed because of airport security or because of me." She paused. "If they find out it was because of me, stop," her mother said sharply. Zuri stopped. The car moved through the city. Her mother's hands were in her lap, and they were not folded now. They were separate, the fingers of one hand pressed hard against the back of the other. "If they find out," her mother said very quietly, "then we're not safe anywhere. Not the new apartment, not the school, not here." "Yes," Zuri said. The words sat between them in the car like a third passenger. They didn't say anything else until they got home. They climbed the 4 flights of stairs because the elevator was still out, and they went into the apartment, and Zuri's mother turned on the lights and stood in the middle of the kitchen for a moment, just standing, and then she went to the organizer on top of the refrigerator and took out all the bills and set them on the table and looked at them. Then she put them back. She said without turning around, "Get ready for bed." Zuri got ready for bed. She lay in her 2 small bed in the dark and listened to the city and listened to her mother moving around the apartment again, the quiet sounds of a woman thinking hard about things that had no good options. At some point, she heard her mother on the phone. Not the words, just the murmur of it, steady and low, and she thought it was probably Su Yan. And her mother was asking more questions or adding conditions or doing the careful, precise work of protecting the 2 of them with the only tools she'd ever had, clarity and stubbornness, and a refusal to accept the frame someone else had built for her. Zuri stared at the ceiling. She thought about what Tae-jin had said. There are more. We don't know how many or how deeply they're positioned. She thought about the cigarette man's jaw going still on the tarmac, and all the stillness that implied, the months of it, the discipline of it, the daily performance of loyalty by someone who is building something in the other direction. She thought about this fact that whoever had planned this was smart enough to put 2 people inside the innermost perimeter of a man who had survived decades by trusting almost no one, which meant they knew things, which meant they had access to things, which meant the failure of the bomb was not just a setback, it was data. It told them something had gone wrong before the altitude trigger. It told them the plan had been intercepted, and it would only take a small amount of looking to find out that the interception had been performed by a child walking past a fence. Somewhere across the city, she understood, someone was already looking, and across that same city, in a room full of glass and city light, a man was sitting with the knowledge that his empire had been penetrated to its center, and the only person who had seen it clearly enough to act was a girl with a hole in her sneaker and a dead linguist's gift in her ear. And whatever he had decided to feel about that was going to have to wait, because the people who had tried to kill him once were already building what they would try next, and they were building it faster than he could. They found out about Zuri on a Tuesday. She didn't know that was the day until much later, until the pieces were placed in front of her in sequence by people who had spent 72 hours assembling them. But Tuesday was when it happened. 3 days after the penthouse meeting, 2 days after the move into the new apartment on Garrison Street that was clean and warm and had a working elevator and no cracked plaster and a fire escape that was bolted properly to the building, and 1 day before everything collapsed. The new apartment had 3 rooms and a kitchen and windows that looked out over a small park where pigeons walked with the authority of property owners. Her mother had stood in the middle of the living room on the first night and looked at it for a long time without speaking, and Zuri had understood that the silence was not unhappiness, but something more complicated. The particular vertigo of a woman who had been holding everything together with her bare hands for 14 months and was now standing in a room that didn't require her to do that, and didn't know yet what to do with her hands. Su Yan had arranged everything, the utilities, the furniture that had been there already, modest and clean and impersonal in a way that would need time to become theirs. The building had a doorman and a security camera system and was registered under a legal entity with no connection to any name Zuri knew. All of this had been explained to her mother in a document that her mother had read 3 times before signing. Zuri had been given a new school placement, a gifted program across the city that she had apparently qualified for 2 years ago, but that had never been communicated to her mother through the underfunded bureaucratic chain responsible for such communications. The paperwork had been expedited in ways Zuri didn't ask about, and her mother had chosen not to examine too closely. On Tuesday morning, Zuri went to her second day at the new school and sat in a classroom where the books were different and the air smelled different, and a boy named Marcus, who sat 2 rows over, was apparently also building a working translation algorithm as a hobby project, which was the first time she had encountered another child whose interior world resembled anything close to her own. On Tuesday afternoon, she came home. On Tuesday evening, Park Jin-ho called. She heard her mother's voice change in the kitchen, a specific shift in register that meant the call was not ordinary. And she came out of her room and stood in the hallway, and her mother was standing at the kitchen counter with the phone pressed hard to her ear, and her other hand flat on the counter, and her knuckles not quite white, but close. Her mother hung up. She looked at Zuri. She said, "Get your shoes." They were taken to a location Zuri hadn't seen before. Not the penthouse, not anything residential, but a floor of a building in a commercial district that had been converted into something operational. Screens on the walls, people at workstations, the specific low-grade tension of a room full of people who had been awake too long and were running on the particular fuel of necessity. It smelled like coffee and the particular metallic quality of recycled air that has been breathed and rebreathed by people under stress. Jin-ho met them at the elevator. His face was composed in the way faces are composed when composure is active work. He said, "Thank you for coming quickly." Her mother said, "What happened?" "Inside," he said. The room he took them to was smaller than the main floor, a conference room with a table and chairs, and one wall that was a single screen currently showing a grid of images and documents and things Zuri couldn't read from the doorway. Kang Tae-jin was there, standing with his back to the door, looking at the screen, his jacket on, his sleeves down. The full formal armor of him in place in a way that was different from the penthouse and different from the tarmac, and told her something was very wrong. He turned when they came in. He looked at Zuri first, then at her mother. He said, "Sit down, please." They sat. He said, "Your name reached the people who organized the attempt on my life. They know a child near the perimeter fence heard the conversation. They have Zuri's name." The room was very quiet. Her mother said, in a voice stripped of everything except the words themselves, "How?" Jin-ho said, "We believe through the airport security system. There's a log from the terminal's incident record. Gerald, the desk attendant, filed a report at the time of the incident. Standard procedure when an unauthorized individual enters a restricted area. The report included Zuri's name, age, and the content of what she'd told him." "You said?" her mother said, and stopped. "We didn't know about the report," Jin-ho said. "Gerald filed it through the airport's standard system. That system has an administrative contractor with access to the incident logs." He paused. "That contractor is connected to the people we're looking for." The particular silence that followed was not like other silences in this story. It had a different quality. The quality of a structure you had believed was solid and have just watched develop a crack that tells you, instantly and without appeal, that it was never solid, that every assumption you had made about it was wrong. Her mother's hand came up and pressed flat against her mouth, a gesture Zuri had never seen her make. Then it came back down, and her mother said very quietly, "You moved us into a building. You told me it was safe. You told me no one connected to this would know her name or location." "The building is safe," Tae-jin said. It's registered through 3 layers of legal separation. The name on the lease has no connection to either of you. But they know her name, her mother said. They know she exists. They know she's the reason the bomb didn't... She stopped. How long ago did this happen? The log was accessed 36 hours ago, Jinho said. 36 hours. Zuri did the calculation automatically. Tuesday morning, while she was sitting in a classroom learning about tonal language families with Marcus 2 rows over. 36 hours, her mother said. She looked at Taejin directly. You've known for 36 hours, and you're telling me now. We spent the 36 hours trying to determine how much they know and whether they'd been able to connect the name to a location, Taejin said. As of 2 hours ago, we believe they have not found the Garrison Street address. That window is time-limited. How time-limited? Her mother said. We don't know, Jinho said, which is why we brought you here tonight. Zuri had been very still through all of this, the way she was still outside the fence on Thursday afternoon when her brain was processing and her body understood that movement would cost her something. She was looking at the screen behind Taejin, the grid of images and documents, and she was looking at one image in the upper right corner of the grid that she had been looking at since they sat down and that she now understood was a photograph of a man she had never seen before. She said, "Who is that?" Everyone looked at her. She pointed at the upper right image on the screen. That man. Who is he? Jinho looked at Taejin. Taejin looked at the screen. Then he looked back at Zuri with that quality of attention that she had come to understand meant he was deciding something about how much to say. He said, "His name is Viktor Drozdov. He is the man who paid for the device on my aircraft." "He's Russian," Zuri said. "Yes." The men outside the fence were speaking Russian. They worked for him, indirectly, through intermediaries. Zuri looked at the photograph. Viktor Drozdov was 60 or so in the image, gray-haired, heavy-set, the face of a man who had spent decades in rooms where decisions were made about other people's lives and had found the experience unremarkable. He was photographed in what appeared to be a restaurant, looking at something outside the frame, his expression the careful blankness of a man who had made neutrality a professional habit. She said, "He's not the only one." The room adjusted, a specific texture to the silence. "What makes you say that?" Jinho said. His voice was very even. "Because if he was the only one, you'd be less afraid," she said. She wasn't being harsh, she was being precise. You're afraid in a specific way. The way you're afraid when something is bigger than you thought. Taejin sat down in the chair across from her. It was the first time she had seen him sit in a room where he wasn't the one who had chosen to sit. He leaned forward, his forearms on the table, the dragon tattoos dark against his skin, and he looked at her with something in his face that was not quite defeat, but was the expression of a man who is very tired of carrying something alone and has just been given, unexpectedly, the option of setting part of it down. He said, "Viktor Drozdov is the Eastern connection, the funding and the technical expertise, but the internal access, the 2 men on my team, the knowledge of my schedule, the specific aircraft, that required someone much closer." He stopped. Zuri waited. 3 nights ago, he said, one of my men under interrogation gave us a name. I've spent 72 hours trying to confirm or disprove it, because if the name is correct, it changes everything about the last 5 years of decisions I've made about this organization. His jaw was working very slightly, a movement she would have missed if she weren't watching closely. The name he gave us is Park Sung-ho. Jinho made a sound. It was not a word. It was the sound a person makes when something hits them in a place they weren't protecting. Zuri looked at Jinho. She looked at the quality of pain on his face and understood before anyone said it. "Is that a relative of yours?" she said. Jinho didn't answer immediately. His jaw had gone the same quality of still as the cigarette man's jaw on the tarmac, but the meaning behind it was completely different. Not concealment, but impact. The stillness of something that has been struck and not yet processed the damage. He said to Taejin in a voice that was very controlled, "My brother has nothing to do with your organization." "I know what I believed," Taejin said. "For 5 years I believed it. He runs a logistics company in Jinho." Taejin's voice was not loud. It didn't need to be. The financial records we pulled in the last 48 hours connect 3 shell companies used to fund Drozdov's operation to a logistics firm registered in your brother's name in 2019. I've had 3 separate people look at it. I'm not telling you this because I want to. I'm telling you because it's true. The silence in the room after that was the worst silence Zuri had experienced in her 8 years. It had a living quality. It breathed. Jinho turned and walked to the wall away from the screen and stood there with his back to the room. His shoulders were set with the terrible rigidity of a man performing stillness over something that wanted very much to be motion. Her mother had her hand over her mouth again. She was looking at Jinho's back with an expression that was entirely human and entirely without any of the calculation of the previous hour. Zuri looked at Taijin. How long has he been inside your organization? Jinho has been with me for 11 years, Taijin said. I meant the brother. Taijin looked at her steadily. We don't know yet. The earliest transaction we can connect to him is 4 years ago, but the structure suggests someone with very detailed knowledge of how we operated was providing that information for longer than that. 4 years. Zuri thought about what 4 years meant at the scale of a man like Tae-jin. The decisions made, the people trusted, the vulnerabilities created in the belief that the perimeter was held. 4 years of a brother feeding information through shell companies to a man in a photograph in a restaurant with a neutral face. Jinho turned back from the wall. His face had been rebuilt in the time he'd spent looking at it. Whatever had broken across it in the first seconds was now behind something composed and specific and more frightening than grief because it had direction. He said to Taejin, "Show me the records." Taejin nodded to someone at the workstation visible through the conference room glass. The screen changed. Columns of financial data replaced the photograph grid. Jinho walked to the screen and stood in front of it and read it. And Zuri watched him read it, watched the moment-by-moment process of a man absorbing evidence that someone he loved had spent years building a structure designed to kill the person he had spent those same years protecting. He read for 4 minutes. No one spoke. Then he turned from the screen and he said to Taejin, "I need to speak with him." Jinho, before anyone else does, I need to be the one to speak with him first. His voice was not raised. It was the opposite of raised. It was the voice of a man who has gone to a place past anger that is much quieter and much more absolute. You owe me that. Taejin was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You have until tomorrow morning." Jinho walked out of the conference room. The door closed with the soft precision of an expensive hinge. The 3 of them left in the room. Taejin, Adayeza, Zuri sat in the new silence. Outside the glass, the workstation staff moved at their screens with practiced care. Nobody looking at the conference room, everyone aware of it. Her mother said, "This isn't about us anymore." "No," Taejin said, "but we're in it." "Yes." Her mother pressed her palms flat on the table in front of her. She looked at them, those cracked, careful hands, and she said, "I want to know exactly what you know about how far the information about my daughter has spread. Not a general reassurance. Exactly what you know." Taejin said, "The incident log was accessed once, from a single IP address that routes through the contractor's system. We have no evidence it was transmitted further, no emails, no encrypted messages, no phone calls we can attribute to her name specifically. What they have, as of now, is a name and an age and the general area of the city where the incident occurred. Garrison Street is not in that general area," her mother said. "No, it's 4 miles north. And the school." A pause. Brief. Significant. "The new school placement was processed through the district office," Taejin said, "which uses the same administrative contractor." The blood left her mother's face. It was visible, a literal change in the color and texture of her skin, and then it came back, and what came back with it was not fear, but something harder and hotter and more focused. "You enrolled my daughter in a school," her mother said, "through a system that you now know is compromised." "We didn't know it was compromised when the enrollment was processed," Taejin said. "We identified the connection to the contractor 48 hours ago." 2 days, her mother said. "She went to that school today. She went today. While you knew, we didn't know whether the school record had been accessed. We still don't. The log files for the district system are, she was there today," her mother said. The room went completely quiet. Zuri thought about the classroom, about Marcus and the translation algorithm, about walking through the hallway and the air that smelled different, and the sense of having found, unexpectedly, a place that might fit. She thought about all the ordinary movements of an ordinary school day, and under each of them she now inserted the possibility of a pair of eyes she hadn't known to look for. She had been trained to hear things. She had not today been listening for anything because she hadn't known to listen. She had been sitting in a classroom being 8 years old. Zuri goes nowhere near that school tomorrow, her mother said. Agreed, Taejin said. She goes nowhere without security. Agreed. And you, her mother started, and then she stopped. And what stopped her was not the loss of words, but the sudden apparent inadequacy of all available words for the size of what she was holding. She had agreed to a legal fund and a safe apartment and careful separation from the operations of a dangerous man, and those agreements had been made in good faith and had lasted approximately 72 hours before they began coming apart at exactly the seams she had most needed to hold. She looked at Taejin with the expression of a woman who is deciding, in real time, how much of her anger to release and how much to keep compressed into something useful. She said, "My daughter saved your life, and the consequence of that is that people who want you dead now know her name." Yes, Taejin said. He didn't qualify it, didn't soften it, and the structure you built to keep her safe has gaps in it that your own people put there. Yes. So what is she now? Her mother said. What is my 8-year-old daughter now, inside your world? Taejin looked at Zuri. Zuri met his gaze. She thought about the tarmac and the fence and her father's voice and the shaking in her hands that had happened after, not during, because during there was no time for shaking. She thought about Jinho reading the financial records and the 4-minute silence of a man losing his brother in real time to a truth that had been built patiently over years. She thought about the fact that she was 8 years old and in a room where the adult responsible for all of this was looking at her like she was the only fixed point available. Taejin said to her, not to her mother, "I'm going to ask you something and I need you to answer honestly." "Okay," she said. "Are you afraid?" She thought about it. Really thought, not performed the consideration of it. She catalogued her body, her breathing, which was even, her hands, which were still, the quality of attention in her chest, which was the sharp, specific alertness of a problem being solved rather than the diffuse heat of panic. "No," she said. "Why not?" "Because being afraid would mean there's nothing I can do," she said. "And there's something I can do." Her mother made a sound. Taejin said, "What is it?" Zuri said, "The people who are looking for me, they know what I heard. They know I understood Russian well enough to know what the conversation meant, which means they know it was the conversation that stopped the plan, not anything else. Not airport security, not a technical failure." She paused. "That means they're building something that doesn't involve a conversation I can overhear. They're adapting. And the thing you need right now isn't more security around me. It's to know what they're building before they finish it." The room was very quiet. "I'm 8, she said. "I know I'm 8, but my father spent 8 years training my ear. And the thing they don't know is that I heard more on that tarmac than the 2 sentences about the bomb. I heard other things I filed away because I didn't know they were important yet." She looked at Taejin steadily. "If you let me tell someone everything I remember, every word, every inflection, every phrase, your people might be able to pull something from it that changes what you're looking for." The silence after this was different from all the previous silences. It was the silence of a room that has just shifted its weight. Her mother said very quietly, "Zuri." "I know," Zuri said. "You understand what you're offering?" "Yes." "You understand that if you do this, you're not on the edge of this anymore. You're in the center of it." Zuri looked at her mother. She looked at the hands on the table, the cracked knuckles, the precise, exhausted care of a woman who had held everything together by refusing to put any of it down. She thought about her father saying, "The only question is whether you help or keep walking." She thought about the fact that she had already answered that question once, on a tarmac, before she understood the full weight of it, and that the answering didn't end on the tarmac. It was continuous. It was ongoing. It was the thing she had stepped into and couldn't step back from regardless of what she decided tonight. She said, "I was already in the center of it. I just didn't know it yet." Taejin looked at her for a long moment. Then he stood up. He walked to the door of the conference room and opened it and called for someone in Korean, and a person came in with a recording device and a chair and set them down across from Zuri with the quiet efficiency of someone who had been waiting to be called. Her mother moved her chair next to Zuri's and sat very close, close enough that their arms touched, and the warmth of her mother's arm against hers was the most ordinary feeling in the room, and Zuri held on to it. She closed her eyes. She went back to the fence. She went back to Thursday afternoon, the jet fuel smell, the turbine sound, the thin October light. She went back to the moment her feet slowed without her permission, and her brain began its automatic processing, and she began, for the first time with intention rather than accident, to unspool everything she had stored. She started talking. She talked for 40 minutes. She gave them everything, every word she had recognized, every phrase, every inflection, the specific quality of the cigarette man's pronunciation that suggested not Moscow, but somewhere further east, Yekaterinburg or Chelyabinsk, the vowels flatter and harder than standard Russian. The phrase the phone man had used for the frequency masking that she'd filed as technical and hadn't known how to classify. And then, at the very end, the thing she had not known she had until this moment, sitting in this room with a recording device in front of her and her mother's arm against hers, and the city doing its indifferent night things outside, a third voice. Brief. From inside the fence, not outside it. A man's voice, very low, saying 4 words in Russian that she had heard and stored without attaching to the conversation because she hadn't known they were connected. She said the 4 words. The person with the recording device went very still. Tae-jin, who had been standing near the wall listening with his arms crossed, uncrossed them. She said, "I don't know what that phrase means exactly. My father's Russian didn't include that vocabulary." The person with the recording device said something to Tae-jin in Korean. Tae-jin's face changed. Not dramatically, but the tiredness in it shifted into something else, something colder and more alert. And he looked at Jin-ho, who had come back into the room at some point while she was talking and was standing by the door. And the look that passed between them was the look of 2 people who have just had the same thought, and neither of them likes it. He said to her, "Say those 4 words again." She said them. He said, "Are you certain?" "Absolutely certain." "Yes," she said. "My father made me repeat things until I was certain. I'm certain." Tae-jin turned away from her. He walked to the window. He stood there with his back to the room and his hands at his sides, and he was very still in the specific way of a man absorbing something that changes the shape of everything he thought he knew. She looked at Jin-ho. Jin-ho's face was doing the thing again, the controlled stillness over something that wanted to be motion, and she understood from looking at it that the 4 words she had just said contained a name, or a location, or a reference that pointed at something much closer than Viktor Drozdov and his restaurant photograph and his Eastern funding. The 4 words she had heard through a fence on a Thursday afternoon pointed at something that had been standing inside Tae-jin's world for years, something that had watched and waited and built its structure carefully, and was now, because of an 8-year-old girl who had not kept walking, exposed in a way it had never expected to be. Tae-jin turned back from the window. He looked at Zuri with the expression she had first seen on a tarmac, the room-changing look, but different now. Because now there was something underneath the attention that she could name, finally. It was the expression of a man who has just realized that the thing standing between him and total destruction is a child who should, by every reasonable measure of the world, be absolutely nowhere near any of this, and who is here anyway, and who is not going to stop being here, and who has just handed him the one piece of information that makes everything else matter. He said, "Zuri, what I'm about to do next will be very dangerous, and I cannot guarantee—" "I know," she said, "that everyone involved in this will make the same choices I intend to make. I know that too." He looked at her for another moment. Then he said, quietly and with a weight that she felt in her sternum more than she heard with her ears, "Your father raised someone extraordinary." Her mother made the sound again, the one that wasn't quite crying but was in the same country. And Zuri felt her mother's arm press harder against hers, and she pressed back, and she looked at Kang Tae-jin standing in his operational room with the city outside and the screens behind him, and the knowledge of 4 words that had just redrawn the map of his entire war, and she understood that she had just crossed the final line between witness and participant, and that there was no version of the next days in which she came through without being changed by them, and that the only question left, the same question it had always been, since the fence, since the tarmac, since her father's voice in her memory saying the only thing that mattered was whether she helped or whether she kept walking. She had never been able to keep walking. She didn't think she was going to start now. The 4 words Zuri had heard through a fence pointed at a man named Choi Byung-soo. She didn't know that until the following morning, when Tae-jin called them back to the operational floor at 6 a.m. and the city was still gray outside, and the workstation staff had clearly not gone home, and the screens showed new configurations of data that had been assembled through the night by people running on coffee and urgency. Jin-ho was not there. No one mentioned Jin-ho. Tae-jin stood at the center of the room and said the name out loud, Choi Byung-soo. The way you say the name of something you've been living with for a long time without knowing it had a name, and the people in the room received it with the particular stillness of professionals absorbing a fact that reorganizes every prior assumption. Choi Byung-soo was 61 years old. He had been a senior financial advisor to Tae-jin's organization for 9 years. He managed the movement of significant portions of the organization's legitimate holdings, the real estate, the investment vehicles, the legal businesses that formed the surface layer of an enterprise whose deeper operations were not discussed in annual reports. He had an office in a building 3 blocks from the penthouse. He had dinner with Tae-jin 4 times a year. He had attended the funeral 2 years ago of Tae-jin's younger cousin and had stood at the graveside with his hat in his hand and his face arranged in the correct expression. The 4 words Zuri had overheard, spoken low and fast inside the fence by someone she had placed as a third person, briefly present, quickly gone, were a phrase specific to a financial system that only 6 people in Tae-jin's organization used. A reference code, the kind of shorthand that exists only between people who work in the same internal language. It was the financial equivalent of a fingerprint, and Zuri had stored it perfectly, including the accent, which the analyst had placed as a man in his 60s who had grown up in Busan and educated himself out of the dialect, but not entirely. Choi Byung-soo had grown up in Busan. Tae-jin had known him for 9 years and had not known him at all. He said, to the room, with a flatness that was more frightening than any raised voice, "Where is he now?" Someone at a workstation said, "His building. He came in at 7:30 yesterday, left at 6, standard pattern. He's been in contact with a number that routes through a relay in Vancouver. 3 calls in the last 48 hours. Since the bomb failed." Yes. Tae-jin looked at the screen for a moment. Then he said, "He knows we're looking. He has the resources to move. How long before he does? If he's smart, he already has an exit prepared. The question is whether the Vancouver relay represents him stabilizing or him triggering." "If it's triggering," Tae-jin said, "what does that mean operationally?" The room was quiet for exactly the wrong length of time. Soo-yeon said from the edge of the room, "It means whatever they're building next is already in motion." Zuri was sitting in a chair against the wall with her mother beside her, both of them brought here in the pre-dawn by 2 of Tae-jin's people because the Garrison Street apartment had been deemed insufficient. And she watched Tae-jin process this and watched the thing on his face that was not panic. He was too old and too experienced for panic, but was the controlled urgency of a man understanding that the timeline has compressed to a point where every hour is doing the work of a week. He turned and looked at her, not at her mother, at her. She said, before he could, "I'm not going anywhere." Her mother said, "Zuri, I'm not going anywhere and you can't make me," she said, not to her mother, to the room, to the specific fact of the situation. Whatever they're building next, if Choi Byung-soo is triggering it, it's already started, which means you need everything I know right now, not after you've relocated us somewhere and set up a new perimeter. Tae-jin said, "There's nothing more you can give us beyond what you gave last night." "You don't know that." Zuri, his voice was quiet, careful in a way that was different from his usual precision. "What I'm about to do today is not something you should be present for." "Then don't tell me about it," she said, "but don't move us somewhere else. If Choi Byung-soo has already triggered whatever comes next, the safest place is wherever your security is thickest, and that's here." He looked at her for a long moment. Her mother had gone very still beside her, not objecting, processing. Tae-jin looked at Soo-yeon. Something passed between them. He said to Adeyezi, Mrs. Okafor, I need your decision. Her mother looked at Zuri. She looked at her with the full weight of 14 months of holding everything alone, all the bills in the organizer, all the double shifts, all the careful architecture of a life being maintained by the absolute refusal to let it collapse. And she looked at her daughter with that weight in her eyes and said, very quietly, you stay in this room. You don't move from this room. If I say we leave immediately. Those are the conditions. Okay, Zuri said. Say it back to me. I stay in this room. I don't move from this room. If you say we leave immediately. Her mother nodded. Once. The way her mother nodded when a decision had been made and would not be revisited. What happened next happened in pieces, across the course of a day that Zuri experienced from a chair against the wall of the operational floor, while the city outside moved through its ordinary business with no knowledge of any of this. At 8:14 a.m., 3 of Tae-jin's people entered Choi Byung-soo's office building under cover of a scheduled maintenance visit. The building's security contractor was not connected to the compromised administrative system. The maintenance cover held for 11 minutes before something changed. Zuri could tell by the shift in Soo-yeon's posture as she monitored communications, the specific way her shoulders dropped a fraction of an inch and then recovered. At 8:26, the maintenance team exited the building. Choi Byung-soo's office was empty. His personal computer had been remotely wiped in the previous 2 hours. His desk contained nothing except what was supposed to be there. Tae-jin received this information standing in the center of the room. His face did not move. He said, "He ran." "Yes." "How long ago?" The wipe timestamp puts it at approximately 4 a.m. 4 a.m. While they were being driven here in the pre-dawn, while the city was still mostly dark. Choi Byung-soo had been in his office, wiping his drives, and whatever exit he'd prepared had already been triggered, and he was already somewhere else. Tae-jin said, "The Vancouver number." Dead as of 2 hours ago, the relay was shut down. The room processed this. Zuri processed it. The shape of what was happening was becoming clear, and it was not a good shape. It was the shape of a plan that had been prepared long in advance by someone who had spent 9 years inside the organization and understood exactly how it responded to threats, and had built his exit around that response. She said from the wall, "He's not running." Several people looked at her. "If he was running, he would have left yesterday," she said. When the bomb failed, that was the moment to run. He waited 2 more days, made 3 calls to Vancouver, and left at 4 a.m. with a computer wipe. He's not running, he's positioning. Tae-jin turned to look at her fully. "He knows you found something," she said. The Vancouver calls were to tell whoever is on the other end that it's time. He left at 4 a.m. because 4 a.m. is when you begin something, not when you end it. The room was very quiet. Soo-yeon said, "She's right." Tae-jin looked at the screens. He looked at the financial data, the call records, the 9 years of a man's presence in his organization reduced to columns of evidence on a wall. He said, to the room in general but to no one specifically, what does he have access to? The answer came from 2 people simultaneously, and it was worse than the question deserved. Choi Byung-soo, as senior financial advisor, had had access to account structures, movement patterns, property locations, not the operational safe houses, those were ring-fenced through a separate system, but the legitimate holdings, the ones that formed the legal surface layer, the ones that connected to real addresses and real buildings and real physical locations, including, processed through the district administrative contractor, the new school placement of a child named Zuri Okafor. The realization landed in Zuri's chest like a dropped weight. He hadn't needed the school record directly. The school record was in the contractor system, which he'd accessed through the financial contractor connection, which meant he'd had the name for 36 hours, and the school for however long it took to run a name through an educational district's records, which was probably automated, which meant he'd had it almost immediately. She said, "He knows where I go to school." The room didn't respond because the room had arrived at the same place. Her mother stood up. She stood up from the chair beside Zuri's, and she looked at Tae-jin and she said, "Get my daughter out of this city." Tae-jin said, "Mrs. Okafor, now, today, whatever car, whatever location. She goes somewhere that is not in the contractor system, not in the district system, not connected to your organization or your holdings or your legitimate surface layer or anything else that Choi Byung-soo had access to for 9 years. Taejin was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Yes. I want to hear the plan. Soo-yeon will walk you through it in the next 10 minutes. There is a location 2 hours outside the city that is registered under a name with no connection to anything we've discussed. 3 people know it exists. Choi Byung-soo is not one of them." 3 people, her mother said. 3. Who? Me. Soo-yeon, and a man named Han who has been with me for 22 years and whose family I know and who knows mine. Her mother looked at him for a long moment with the particular assessment of a woman deciding whether the word of a dangerous man was worth the paper it wasn't written on. Then she said, "Soo-yeon, walk me through it." Soo-yeon moved. Her mother moved with her toward the far side of the room where a quieter conversation could happen, and Zuri started to rise from her chair, and her mother said without turning, "You, stay." She stayed. Taejin came and stood near her. Not looming, just close, the way adults stood near children in rooms where things were being decided about the children. He looked at the screens, she looked at the screens. She said, "You're not going with us?" "No, because you have to find him." "Yes." She looked at the photograph of Choi Byung-soo that had replaced the Viktor Drozdov image on the upper right of the grid. A different face from Drozdov's. Younger, sharper, with something behind the eyes that she could see now, in the knowledge of what he'd done, that she would not have seen before, a specific quality of patience, the patience of a man who has been waiting for a long time and has learned to make the waiting look like loyalty. "He's going to try to use me," Zuri said. "That's why he positioned instead of running. He knows you won't stop looking for him. And he knows that you won't, that you'd—" She paused, working through it. "He knows you have a reason to be careful now, a reason that didn't exist before Thursday afternoon." Taejin was very still. "He's going to use me to make you make a mistake," she said. He said, "That is what I believe, yes." "So what do you do about it?" He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I don't make the mistake." "You think that's easy?" "No," he said. "I think it's the hardest thing I've done in 30 years, because the reason he can use you is real. The reason is, it's not manufactured. I can't pretend it isn't there." He paused. She could feel the weight of the pause, the specific gravity of it. "You're 8 years old and you walked into the middle of something that has nothing to do with you and you're still doing it. And the thing I cannot do is treat that the way I've treated every other expendable element of every other situation in my adult life. I cannot do it. And Choi knows that. Because Choi watched me for 9 years, and in 9 years, he never saw me fail to treat things as expendable." He said it flatly, without self-pity, just as accounting. "You're the first thing in 9 years that I haven't been able to." Zuri looked at him. She thought about expendable. She thought about her father's careful instruction in tonal languages and the way he'd said superpower over his morning tea like it was just weather. She thought about her mother's hands on the kitchen table and the bills in the organizer and the crack in the plaster behind the picture frame. She said, "Then don't be careful because of me. Be careful because being careful is how you win." He looked at her. "That is the same thing." "No, it isn't," she said. "One of those is a weakness. The other one is a strategy." The city moved outside. The screens flickered. Somewhere across the operational floor a phone rang and was answered in 2 words, and the information it contained moved through the room like a current. Jin-ho came in at 11 a.m. He came in from the stairwell, not the elevator, and he looked like a man who had not slept and had spent the night somewhere that had cost him something permanent. His jacket was different from last night's. His face had been put back together, but there were fault lines in it that hadn't been there before and weren't going away. He went directly to Tae-jin. They stood together near the window. The conversation was in Korean, and it was low and it was not long. When it was done, Jin-ho looked across the room at Zuri. It was not a complicated look. It was the look of a man who has just spent a night dismantling something he loved and has come out the other side into the specific cold clarity of a person who has nothing left to protect except the thing they choose next. He said, in English across the room, "My brother gave me a location." The operational floor went quiet. Taejin said, "Jin-ho." "He gave it to me voluntarily." Jinho said. He gave it to me because I'm his brother, and because he knows what I'll carry either way, and he decided to give me the one thing that might make the carrying possible. His jaw was set. His eyes were red at the edges in a way that was the only visible evidence of the night he'd had. Choi Byung-soo is in a building on the east waterfront. He's been there since 4 a.m. He has 2 people with him, and he's waiting. Waiting for what? Soo-yeon said. Confirmation, Jinho said. He's waiting for confirmation that whatever comes next has been deployed. He doesn't know we have this location. He believes he has until tonight before we're close. Tae-jin said, Your brother told you this? Yes. Why? Jinho looked at him. It was a long look, and in it was the entire compressed weight of 11 years of loyalty and one night of its destruction, and whatever his brother had said in whatever room they'd been in together, and it was not a look that could be translated into any language Zuri knew. He said, because he said he wasn't trying to destroy you. He said Choi convinced him it was restructuring, that you'd survive and come out smaller and more manageable, and that's what everyone around you needed. His voice was flat. Not believing it, just reporting it. He said he didn't know about the bomb. He said the money was supposed to be leverage, not killing. He paused. I don't know if that's true. I'm not in a position to know if that's true. The room held that. Tae-jin said, But you gave me the location anyway. Yes. Knowing what comes next for him. Yes. The 2 men looked at each other. Zuri thought she understood some of what was in that look and knew she didn't understand most of it, and that the part she didn't understand was the specific weight of a debt and a love and a betrayal that had all been built on the same years and couldn't be separated now without taking pieces of each other with them. Tae-jin said, I'll remember this. Jinho said, Don't, just end it. It took 47 minutes to assemble in position. Zuri knew because she counted again, the same way she'd counted the 11 minutes on the tarmac, because her brain needed something to hold on to, and numbers were reliable in a way that almost nothing else in the last 4 days had been. Her mother was with Soo-yeon on the far side of the room, and Zuri had been told twice to stay seated and had stayed seated, and she watched the operational floor shift into a configuration that was different from its previous states, tighter, more directional, the people in it moving with the specific economy of motion that belongs to people who are preparing to go somewhere and do something that cannot be undone. Tae-jin put his jacket on. He checked something at his side, a motion she didn't look at directly. He came to her before he left. He stood in front of her chair, and she looked up at him, and he looked down at her, and he said, You go with Soo-yeon. You go now, before we move, so there are no connections between your location and this one. Okay, she said. Zuri. Yes. Whatever happens in the next few hours, whatever you hear, whatever anyone tells you, you stay where Soo-yeon puts you. You don't move, you don't make decisions. You let the adults do the last part of this. She looked at him. She thought about what she'd said. Not careful because of me. Careful because it's how you win. She thought about the difference between a weakness and a strategy. She thought about her father's voice saying, when someone is about to get hurt, the only question is whether you help or keep walking. She said, Come back. He looked at her for a moment with the room-changing expression, the one that had started on a tarmac and had been changing the rooms between them ever since. He said, That's the plan. He walked to the stairwell. Jinho followed him. 3 others followed. The stairwell door closed and the sound of them was gone, and the operational floor held the absence of them like a breath it was waiting to release. Soo-yeon appeared beside her. Let's go, she said. Zuri stood. She went to her mother. Her mother took her hand, not the way she held her hand crossing streets, automatic and habitual, but deliberately, the full grip of a woman choosing to hold something, and they followed Soo-yeon to the elevator. The car was waiting in the underground garage. They got in. The garage door opened onto a side street and the car moved out into the city's ordinary mid-morning traffic. Other cars, other people, a delivery truck double parked, a woman walking a dog, the absolute democratic indifference of the urban world continuing its business around events that would not be in any newspaper. Zuri looked out the back window. The building they'd just left diminished in the rear window as the car moved away from it. The city swallowed it. Everything looked like everything else. She turned back and looked at her mother's hand holding hers and thought about Tae-jin in a stairwell going down toward a garage, going toward the east waterfront, where a man with a patient face was sitting in a building waiting for confirmation that a plan built over 4 years and 9 years of access to the inside of an organization was finally, irreversibly executing. She thought about what Choi Byung-soo didn't know. He didn't know that an 8-year-old girl had been walking past a fence on a Thursday afternoon with her father's gift in her ear and her father's voice in her memory. He didn't know about a third voice she'd filed away without knowing why. He didn't know that a man who had spent 30 years treating everything as expendable had met something he couldn't. He didn't know that Jinho's brother, sitting somewhere with whatever remained of his choices, had looked at his brother across whatever distance the night had put between them and had given him the one thing that couldn't be taken back. Choi Byung-soo was in a building on the east waterfront, waiting for confirmation. What was coming instead was Kang Tae-jin. That was what was coming instead. The building on the east waterfront was a converted warehouse, 3 stories, the kind that had been industrial once, and had sat in the middle of a rezoning argument for 6 years, while water damage worked its way through the upper floors and the lower floor became useful to people who needed space without questions. Choi Byung-soo had used it twice before, not for anything Tae-jin's people had known about at the time, but for things they could reconstruct now, in retrospect, with the particular clarity of information that arrives too late to have prevented anything but in time to mean something. They went in at noon. Tae-jin did not send people in advance. He did not establish a perimeter and wait. He went in the way he had spent 30 years never going in, because the way he had always operated, cautious, layered, never exposed, was exactly what Choi Byung-soo had mapped for 9 years and built his exit around. The one thing Choi had not built around was the thing Tae-jin had not done in 3 decades. He walked through the front. Jinho was beside him, 3 others behind. The door was unlocked because Choi was waiting, and a locked door would have been a statement. And Choi was not, at his core, a man who made statements. He was a man who made arrangements, careful and patient and invisible until they weren't. The ground floor was concrete and water-stained, and the smell of the river coming through gaps in the upper structure. Light came from industrial fixtures strung along the ceiling, half of them dead. Crates along the walls, old, whatever had been in them long since gone. Choi Byung-soo was sitting in a chair in the center of the floor. He was sitting in it the way a man sits when he has chosen his position, and his position is the point. Upright, hands visible on the armrests, jacket on, the same patient face from the restaurant photograph, except in person. And in this light it was different, because in person the patience had texture. It was not the patience of a man who was comfortable. It was the patience of a man who had decided that composure was the only leverage he had left, and he was using it. 2 people stood behind him. They were not pointing anything. Their hands were at their sides. This was also a decision. Tae-jin stopped walking when he was 15 feet from Choi. Jinho stopped beside him. The 3 behind spread slightly without instruction. Nobody spoke for a moment. Then Choi said in Korean, "I wasn't sure you'd come yourself." Tae-jin said, "I wasn't sure either." Something changed. Several things, Tae-jin said. Over the last 4 days, several things changed. Choi looked at him. The patience on his face had something underneath it now. Not fear, not yet, but the specific alertness of a man reading a room he thought he knew and finding it different from his preparation. He said, "The child," among other things. "I underestimated that," Choi said. It was not an apology. It was an accountant noting a variance. The probability of a language-capable child on that specific walkway at that specific time. "I ran the variables. I didn't run that one." "Nobody runs that one," Tae-jin said. "That's the point." Choi's eyes moved to Jinho. They stayed there for a moment. Something crossed his face that was the closest thing to an expression Zuri would later be told about. Not guilt, which required a different architecture of the self than Choi Byung-soo had ever built, but something like acknowledgement. The recognition of a cost he had calculated as acceptable and was now seen paid in the face of the man beside his employer. He said to Jinho, "Your brother made his choice." Jinho said nothing. "I didn't coerce him," Choi said. "He came to me. 4 years ago he came to me because he believed, as I believe, that this organization had grown into something that served one man's ego more than it served any rational purpose. Jinho's jaw was the jaw Zuri had seen last night, set, controlled, the enormous stillness of something working very hard not to move. He said in a voice like concrete, "Don't." "I'm explaining. I said don't." Not louder, harder. The single syllable of a man who has spent a night in a room with his brother and has nothing left for explanation. "Whatever you're explaining, I've heard it. I heard it all night. Save it." Choi closed his mouth, recalibrated, looked back at Tae-jin. He said, "You know what I find interesting? In 9 years, you never asked me about my family." Tae-jin said, "I know about your family. You know the facts. You had me researched when you hired me. Wife, 2 daughters, house in the West Side District." Choi paused. "You don't know that my older daughter has a condition that has cost, in the last 7 years, approximately $400,000 in treatments that are not covered by any insurance structure your organization provided. You know facts. You don't know what they cost." The warehouse held the sound of the river through its gaps. A gull somewhere. Tae-jin said, "You should have come to me." "I did," Choi said. And for the first time, the composure shifted. Not collapsed, but shifted. A single fault line visible beneath the surface. 3 years ago. You don't remember. I came to you about a supplemental coverage restructuring, and you referred me to the administrative office, and the administrative office referred me to a form, and the form was denied in 6 weeks. You don't remember because it was small to you. The silence after that was different from the previous silences. It had more weight. Tae-jin looked at him. He looked at him the way he had looked at Zuri on the tarmac, with that full quality of attention, not performing it, but actually doing it. And what was in his face was not guilt. It was something more uncomfortable than guilt, which is the recognition of an accurate accusation. He said, "That's true." Choi blinked. It was the smallest movement in the room, and it was significant because it was involuntary. "It's true," Tae-jin said again. "I don't remember, and I should. And the fact that I don't is part of everything that got us to this warehouse." He paused. "It doesn't change what you did, but it's true." Choi looked at him for a long moment. The patience on his face was doing something more complicated now, unraveling slightly at the edges, the way a structure does when you remove a load-bearing element it had built itself against. He had prepared for anger. He had prepared for denial. He had prepared for the particular ruthless efficiency of a man who had survived 30 years by not allowing sentiment into operational decisions. He had not prepared for accuracy. He said, "What happens now?" "Viktor Drozdov was taken at the port this morning," Tae-jin said. "His operation is finished. The financial structures your brother helped build have been frozen through 3 separate legal mechanisms that Soo-yeon filed at 7 a.m. He said it not as a victory, but as an inventory. There is no next move. Whatever you were waiting for confirmation of, it's not coming." The 2 people behind Choi moved, not toward Tae-jin's people, toward the door. And Tae-jin's people did not stop them, because those were not the terms of today. And the terms of today had been set by the decision Tae-jin had made in the stairwell, that the only way to end something this embedded in his organization was to cut cleanly at the root and let the branches fall where they fell. Choi sat in his chair alone. He looked at his hands on the armrests. He looked at them for a moment the way Zuri's mother looked at her hands, that accounting gesture, the inventory of what hands have done and what they have not. He said, "My daughter is not part of this," Tae-jin said. "Your family is not touched. That was decided before I came here." Choi looked up. There was something in his face now that had not been there before, and would not have been predicted by any photograph or 9 years of proximity. It was something undone. The patience had served its purpose, and the purpose was over, and what was underneath it was just a man in a chair who had spent 4 years building something meticulous and had forgotten to account for the one variable no rational system includes. He said, "A child." "Yes," Tae-jin said. 8 years old. 8 years old. Choi was quiet for a moment. Then he said, not to Tae-jin, not to Jin-ho, but to the air in front of him. To no one in particular. "I would not have..." And he stopped. He stopped because the sentence had nowhere to go that he was willing to follow it, and they both knew it. And leaving it unfinished was the most honest thing he'd said. What happened after that, Zuri was told in pieces later, and she assembled the pieces into a sequence that was not triumphant and not clean, but was true. Choi Byung-soo was removed from the warehouse and delivered to a legal proceeding that Soo-yeon had spent 48 hours constructing. Jin-ho's brother cooperated fully, which was both because he had already chosen to cooperate by giving Jin-ho the location and because there was nothing left to protect. The legal structures took time, weeks, then months, but they held. Viktor Drozdov's operation unwound without its financial spine. 3 other people inside Tae-jin's organization who had been connected to the 4-year structure were identified and removed, 2 of them through their own confessions and 1 through evidence that left no alternative. The administrative contractor who had accessed the incident log was audited and its connection to Drozdov's network was documented and severed. Gerald, at the airport, was informed that his routine incident report had been accessed by unauthorized parties and was moved to a different facility at his own request, and was sent, through an anonymous legal channel, a gift card to the bookstore he apparently frequented on lunch breaks. None of this was narrated to Zuri as it happened. She was told what was necessary when it was over, which was her mother's decision, and which Tae-jin honored without discussion. What she knew during the hours it was happening was a room 2 hours outside the city, clean, spare, a house that smelled like wood and cold air, and had a window that looked out over flat land that stretched to a distant tree line. Soo-yeon made tea. Her mother sat beside her on a couch, and they watched the light change through the window from noon to afternoon to the particular orange quality of late afternoon in October. And her mother held her hand the whole time, the deliberate grip, not the automatic street crossing grip. At 4:17 p.m., Soo-yeon's phone buzzed. She looked at it. She said, "It's done." Her mother exhaled. It was a long exhale, the length of 4 days compressed into a single breath released. Zuri looked out the window at the flat land and the distant trees. She thought about a tarmac. She thought about the shaking in her hands that had happened after, not during. She thought about the cigarette man's jaw and Jin-ho's jaw and Choi Byung-soo's hands on the armrests of a chair and her mother's hands on a kitchen table and her father's hands stirring tea in the old apartment saying, "Superpower," like it was just weather. She thought about the particular quality of a world that contains people who build patient, destructive things over 4 years and also contains an 8-year-old girl walking home from school with a hole in her sneaker, and how those 2 things had intersected on a Thursday afternoon, because the world is indifferent to the scale of what it puts in each other's path. She said to the window, "Is he okay?" Soo-yeon understood the question. "Yes." And Jin-ho, a pause. "Jin-ho he will be in time." Zuri nodded. She thought about what in time meant for a man who had spent a night in a room with his brother and come out the other side carrying a location. She thought that in time was probably the only honest answer, and that honest answers were the only kind worth having. They came back to the city the following morning. The Garrison Street apartment was still theirs. Her mother stood in the middle of the living room the same way she'd stood the first night, assessing it, feeling its walls. And this time what was on her face was different. Not the vertigo of a woman whose hands didn't know what to do, something more settled. The particular groundedness of someone who has been through an extreme thing and come back and found that the floor is still the floor. She said, "We need a rug." Zuri looked at her. "The living room needs a rug," her mother said, "and a plant. Something that requires attention." "Okay," Zuri said. "We'll go Saturday." "Okay." Her mother went to the kitchen and started making breakfast, and the sounds of it, the pan on the burner, the specific rhythm of her mother moving in a kitchen, were the most ordinary sounds Zuri had heard in 5 days, and she stood in the living room and let them be ordinary for a moment before she went to help. She went back to school on Monday. Not the new school. The new school was being reconsidered, reevaluated through systems that Soo-yeon was auditing with assistance that Zuri didn't ask the details of. She went back to her old school on Meridian, 3rd grade, the classroom with the stain on the carpet near the reading corner whose origin remained theorized. Her teacher asked if she felt better, and she said yes. Marcus, the boy with the translation algorithm, was at a different school across the city, and she thought about him sometimes, and thought that perhaps the world was large enough that 2 children whose interior lives resembled each other might find their way to the same conversation eventually. She walked the Meridian route home that first Monday. Her mother had offered the bus. She had said no. She walked past the chain-link fence of Meridian Aviation, the second gate, the place where she had slowed without meaning to on a Thursday afternoon 3 weeks ago. She stopped. She stood on the public sidewalk and looked through the fence at the tarmac. The white jet with the blue stripe was not there. A different aircraft was at the near terminal, smaller, unremarkable, its ground crew going about their work with the particular concentration of people for whom the work is just work. She looked at the spot where she had stood when she'd heard them. She looked at the fence and the gate and the service entrance and the concrete of the tarmac beyond. She thought about her father. She thought about him specifically the way she had been avoiding thinking about him for 3 weeks because there was too much else to hold, and she had needed both hands. She thought about him stirring tea. She thought about Sunday mornings with Russian children's books. She thought about the careful, patient architecture of a man who had understood that the greatest thing he could give a daughter was not security. He hadn't had the resources for security, but the specific equipment to navigate a world that would not always be gentle with her. He had given her languages. He had given her the understanding that listening was not passive but active, that hearing accurately was a form of action, that the gap between what people said and what they meant was not a place to get lost, but a place to learn. He had given her the knowledge that if someone is about to get hurt, the only question is whether you help or keep walking. He had given her all of this, and then he had died, which was the one thing he couldn't help, and she had carried it and was still carrying it and was going to carry it for the rest of her life, which she understood was not a tragedy, but a truth, and that the difference between a tragedy and a truth was whether you let it make you smaller or whether you let it make you more precisely yourself. She stood at the fence for a while. Not long. Then she adjusted the straps of her backpack, 2 clicks tighter than the school required, and she walked home. Taejin came to see them 3 weeks later. He came to the Garrison Street apartment, not summoned, not arranged through Soo-yeon, but called her mother directly, the number they had exchanged, and asked. Her mother said yes after a pause that lasted long enough to mean something and short enough to mean she had already decided. He came on a Saturday evening. He wore no jacket. He brought nothing, no envelope, no gesture, just himself and the particular quality of attention that she had first registered on a tarmac and had not stopped registering since. Her mother made tea. They sat in the living room that now had a rug, dark green, practical, exactly right, and a plant on the windowsill that was a pothos because pothos were difficult to kill, and her mother believed in starting with honest expectations. He said, I wanted to see you both. We're here, her mother said. Not unwelcoming, just exact. He looked around the room. He looked at the rug and the plant and the way the apartment had become, in the weeks since the move, something that had the texture of belonging to people. He looked at the picture frame on the wall. Her mother had brought it from the old apartment, the one that covered the crack in the plaster. Except here there was no crack, so it just hung on the wall as what it was, a photograph of Emmanuel Okafor laughing at something outside the frame, taken before he got sick. Taejin looked at the photograph for a moment. He said, "Your husband." "Yes," her mother said. He looked at it for another moment. Then he said, "He did something extraordinary. Whatever he built in her, whatever the years of work looked like from the inside, the result of it was that a child was capable of doing what she did. That's not an accident. That's someone's intention realized." Her mother was quiet. The quality of her quiet was not the managed blankness of the penthouse meeting. It was something more open than that, more human. She said, "He would have worried if he'd known what she was walking into." "Yes," Taejin said, "and then he would have been proud." In that order. Her mother looked at the photograph. She pressed her lips together once, briefly, and then she released it and looked back at Taejin with the full directness she used when she had decided to trust something, cautiously, provisionally, with both eyes open. She said, "What happens now? For you." He was quiet for a moment. "Change," he said, "which is harder than it sounds when the thing you're changing has been built over 30 years. He paused. "The financial structures that Choi compromised are being rebuilt with different oversight. The people who were positioned inside because of fear rather than integrity are being replaced. It's not fast work, and it's not clean." "Is it real?" she said. He looked at her. He understood what she was asking. "I don't know yet," he said. "That's the honest answer. I know what I intend. Whether intention becomes fact is a question I'll be answering for a long time." She nodded. She accepted this because it was honest, and she was a woman who preferred honest uncertainties to confident fabrications. She got up to refill the tea. In the kitchen, she moved with the rhythm Zuri knew completely. The particular efficiency of a woman who had organized scarce resources for a long time and now had slightly less scarce resources but the same habits. And the habits were good ones and didn't need replacing. Taejin looked at Zuri. They were alone in the living room for the first time since the tarmac, and the quality of the silence between them was not uncomfortable but was full, the way silences are between people who have been through something together that doesn't have a category yet. He said, "Are you all right?" "Yes," she said. "You should be angry." "I'm not." "Most people would be." "I know," she said. "But being angry would mean it happened to me. I don't think it happened to me. I think I was there for it. Those are different." He looked at her with the expression. She had learned over the past weeks of processing that the expression had a name after all, or at least a description. It was the look of a man encountering a kind of clarity he had stopped expecting to find in the world, and the encountering of it doing something small but permanent to the architecture of him. He said, "What do you want? Not what your mother wants for you, not what I've set up for you. What you want." She thought about it. Genuinely, the way she thought about hard things, fully, without performing the consideration. She said, "I want to study languages. All of them. I want to understand why some people hear the music in them and some people only hear the words." She paused. "I want there to be a place where children who hear the music can go and not be told that's not the useful skill, that there are other things they should be focusing on." He was quiet. She said, "You were going to do something like that anyway. Su Yan mentioned a foundation, an education thing." "Yes." "Make it about language," she said. "Specifically, make it about children who hear the world differently and need a place that hears them back." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "That's what it will be." She believed him. Not because he was reliable in the way banks were reliable, or contracts were reliable, or any structure was reliable. She had learned enough in the last month to know that structures were only as reliable as the people inside them. But because she had watched his face through 5 days of things that had cost him something real, and she had learned to read him the way she read language. Not just the words, but the music underneath. And the music underneath was the music of a man making a true decision. Her mother came back from the kitchen with the tea. They sat in the living room with the green rug and the pothos plant and Emmanuel Okafor's photograph on the wall, and they drank tea, and the city did its evening things outside the window. The traffic, the voices, the hydraulic sigh of the bus, the cycling of the traffic signals. And it was ordinary, and the ordinariness of it was not nothing. It was, in fact, the thing that the last 5 days had been about, though she hadn't had the words for it until now. Ordinary life. The right to it. The cost of protecting it, which was sometimes enormous and sometimes looked like a child with a backpack walking home from school with her ears open, and sometimes looked like a man in a warehouse chair whose composure finally ran out, and sometimes looked like a brother who made a choice in the dark that he would carry for the rest of his life, and sometimes looked like another man walking through a front door instead of sending others, because the old way had cost him everything, and the new way cost him something different, and he was willing to pay it. Taejin left at 9. At the door he stopped. He looked at Zuri the way he had looked at her on the tarmac, crouching to her level, eye to eye, except now he didn't crouching because she was standing on the threshold with the door open and they were already at the same level, or close enough. He said, "I'm going to build something worth the cost of what you did." She looked at him. She thought about her father's voice saying when someone is about to get hurt. She thought about the shaking in her hands that happened after. She thought about the way he had looked at her on the tarmac like she was a complete and serious person at a time when no one else in the vicinity was extending her that particular courtesy. She said, "I know." He nodded. He left. The elevator door closed. Her mother put her arm around Zuri's shoulders, and they stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at the closed elevator, and then her mother pulled her back inside and closed the door. And the apartment was just the apartment, warm, quiet, smelling like tea and the faint earthiness of the pothos plant that her mother had watered that morning for the first time. Zuri went to her room. She sat on her bed, which was the right size now, because one of the small practical things that had changed was a bed that fit. And she sat in the middle of it and looked at the window where the city's ambient light came in, orange and diffuse. She thought about everything in sequence, the way her father had taught her to process information. Start at the beginning, move forward, don't skip, don't editorialize, just place each thing in order and let the order speak. The fence, the turbine sound, the Russian voices, the 3-second moment of her feet slowing without her permission, the run across the tarmac, the engine roar in her sternum, the screaming of a word she'd never had occasion to scream before, and hoped, without quite believing it, she might never need to scream again. A man crouching to her eye level, dark, tired eyes. The question, "Why did you run toward me instead of away?" Her father's answer coming through her mouth because it was the only true answer available. And then all the rest of it. The penthouse, the operational floor, the 4 words through a fence that turned out to be a key, the night Jin-ho spent with his brother, the warehouse, the chair, the patient face finally undone, the flat land outside a window 2 hours from the city, her mother's deliberate grip. And then this evening. Green rug, pothos plant, tea. She placed all of it in order and let the order speak. What it said, when she listened without editorializing, was not a story about a crime boss or an assassination plot or a 9-year betrayal or a 4-year financial structure. Those were the circumstances. The story underneath them, the one her father would have asked her to find, the one he was interested in, the actual music beneath the words, was about what people do when they encounter something that costs more than they expected. Some of them calculate the cost and find it unacceptable and build toward a different outcome over 4 patient years. Some of them carry a cost all night in a room with their brother and then hand over the one thing they can't take back. Some of them sit in warehouses and wait for confirmation that never comes and find, in the space where their composure used to be, a sentence they can't finish. Some of them stand in kitchens making tea and hold their daughter's hands with their full grip and say the conditions out loud and mean everyone. And some of them, not many, not often, but sometimes, on a Thursday afternoon in October when the light is thin and the turbines are spinning up and everything is exactly ordinary, some of them slow down and listen and run. Zuri Okafor lay back on her right-sized bed in her warm room in the city that was still exactly itself and closed her eyes. Outside, the world continued at its usual scale. The traffic and the voices and the signals cycling through their colors and the pigeons on the park benches below with their property owner authority. All of it indifferent, all of it continuous, all of it going about its business of being the world without commentary on the specific extraordinary thing that had happened inside it 4 weeks ago on a tarmac beside a private airfield. She thought just before sleep, he would have been proud. In that order, she let the city hold her. She slept.